The ancient Rodaxian formal rite of peace has not been seen in generations.
What exactly is the Sesnar? At first glance, the answer seems pretty simple. The Sesnar Grand is just a vacation resort, the kind of place where Starfleet officers can escape their uniforms, forget about diplomacy for a few hours, and make some spectacularly bad decisions. But Strange New Worlds has always been very good at hiding interesting ideas underneath its comedy. And in Human Best Friend, the Sesnar setting is what makes the entire episode possible. Because this isn't just a planet where the Enterprise crew happens to go on vacation. The atmosphere itself changes how their bodies and minds function, creating a bizarre situation where almost the entire senior staff effectively loses control of themselves. And that gives the episode its central gimmick. Pike is trying to give his officers a break before an important peace negotiation. Instead, the crew spends the night in a state of chemically induced intoxication, wakes up with huge gaps in their memories, and leaves Ortegas and Scotty trying to reconstruct what happened before the negotiations begin. It's basically Star Trek meets The Hangover, but the more interesting question is what the Sesnar environment actually tells us about the world of Strange New Worlds. Because the Sesnar Grand isn't simply a hotel. It's a place where an entire planet's natural environment has become part of the vacation experience. And that's a very strange idea when you think about it. The basic setup is straightforward. The Enterprise has important peace negotiations coming up, and Captain Pike decides that his senior officers need some time away from their responsibilities. That alone is actually pretty believable for this crew. These people spend their lives flying through dangerous parts of space, dealing with alien civilizations, temporal anomalies, hostile encounters, and situations where one wrong decision can kill everyone aboard. So Pike gives them a vacation. The destination is the Sesnar Grand. And the big attraction isn't simply beautiful scenery or luxury accommodations, it's the planet's atmosphere. The gases present in the environment create a sensation of intoxication. In other words, the planet itself is capable of getting visitors drunk. That's a pretty clever piece of science fiction world building, even if the episode mostly uses it as a setup for comedy. And it immediately raises a question. If these gases affect humanoid visitors this strongly, how does life on Sesnar function normally? Are the native inhabitants adapted to the atmosphere? Is the intoxicating effect something that's dangerous only to outsiders? Or has the Sesnar Grand essentially turned a natural planetary phenomenon into a tourist attraction? The material we've been given doesn't actually answer those questions. And that's important, because there is a temptation with Star Trek to take a name like Sesnar and immediately assume there's some enormous piece of hidden lore behind it. But based on this episode's information, we don't have evidence of a secret Sesnar species or some hidden identity. What we do have is much simpler: a planet, a resort, and an atmosphere that produces an intoxicating effect on the visitors. And honestly, that's enough to create a pretty interesting setting. The reason the Sesnar environment matters so much is that the crew doesn't simply get drunk and remember everything the next morning. Ortegas and Scotty wake up without remembering what happened. That's the real problem. Because the rest of the senior staff have effectively become unreliable witnesses to their own night. And suddenly the two people who need to figure out what happened are the two people who have to piece together the evidence afterward. That changes the structure of the story. Instead of watching the crew experience one ridiculous event after another, we are watching Ortegas and Scotty investigate the aftermath. And that makes the Sesnar atmosphere function almost like a mystery device. What happened? Where did the shuttle go? What happened to the crew? Why can't anyone remember? And how are they supposed to get back to the Enterprise in time for negotiations? The planet has essentially turned the senior staff into unreliable narrators. And that is where the Sesnar setting becomes more useful than it initially appears. Because Star Trek normally gives its characters an enormous technological advantage. If something goes wrong, somebody pulls out a tricorder. If they're lost, the computer knows where they are. If there's a medical problem, Dr. Mabenga or Chapel can probably figure it out. But here, the problem is much more basic. The characters don't remember what happened, and even their technology isn't necessarily enough to immediately solve the problem. At one point, the search for the tricorder itself becomes part of the comedy, only for Scotty to break it. It's ridiculous. But it also reinforces the central idea of the Sesnar experience. The crew have temporarily lost the competence that normally defines them. And that is probably the most important thing to understand about the Sesnar environment. It doesn't just make the characters drunk, it removes their normal sense of control. Pike isn't behaving like the captain we know. La'an isn't behaving like the disciplined security officer we know. Una is singing karaoke in Klingon. The entire senior staff is behaving like completely different versions of themselves. That's obviously being played for comedy, but there's an interesting character element underneath it. What happens when you take away the professional identities these people have built? Pike isn't Captain Pike for a while. La'an isn't the head of security. Spock isn't simply the logical science officer. They're people on vacation. And the Ceznar atmosphere gives them permission, or perhaps simply forces them, to behave in ways they normally wouldn't. That's why the episode's best material actually comes from Ortegas and Scotty. Their relationship has already been tense, and the strange circumstances eventually force them to confront why. They each admit that some of their irritation toward the other is actually rooted in insecurity about their own abilities. That's a much more interesting use of the Sesnar setup than simply having characters fall over and behave foolishly, because suddenly the intoxication becomes a way of removing their defenses. They're saying things they might normally avoid saying. And underneath all the chaos, that's where the episode actually finds some character development. But the Sesnar setting also creates one of the episode's biggest problems. The entire story depends on the audience accepting that these highly trained Starfleet officers can spend an extended period behaving completely irrationally without the situation becoming too serious. And that's difficult to balance. Because Star Trek works when its fictional reality feels real to the characters. We know the Enterprise isn't real. We know these people don't actually live hundreds of years in the future. But within the story, the Enterprise is real to them. Their jobs are real. The diplomatic mission is real. The consequences are real. And that makes the comedy more difficult. If the crew is simply having a silly vacation, that's one thing. But they're supposed to return to the ship and participate in important peace negotiations. So eventually you have to ask the following. How much absurdity can the story get away with before the Sesnar vacation stops feeling like something these characters would actually do? That's where the episode becomes divisive. The Sesnar concept itself is fun. The execution is another matter. The planetary gases provide a perfectly reasonable science fiction explanation for the crew's behavior, but explaining why everyone is drunk doesn't automatically make every joke work. And some of the episode's comedy pushes the characters so far out of their established personalities that the Sesnar environment starts feeling less like a real place and more like an excuse for a sketch comedy episode. There's also something wonderfully strange about the Sesnar Grand as a concept. Star Trek has shown us luxury resorts before. It has shown us strange alien planets. It has shown us recreational worlds. But a resort built around an atmosphere that naturally makes visitors feel intoxicated is a particularly weird piece of future world building. Because imagine what the Federation must look like if places like this exist. Travelers can apparently visit another planet specifically because its atmosphere creates a pleasurable altered state. That suggests a civilization where recreational experiences have become extraordinarily sophisticated. You don't necessarily need alcohol anymore. You can just visit another world. Of course, the obvious problem is that the human body isn't necessarily designed for every alien atmosphere. And that's exactly what the senior staff discover. The thing that makes the Sesnar Grand attractive to visitors is also what makes it dangerous. That's a very Star Trek idea. A natural phenomenon becomes a tourist attraction because somebody figures out how to make it safe enough. But once people start using it recreationally, the possibility of something going wrong becomes inevitable. And in this case, something definitely goes wrong. There are also some fun details scattered around the episode that make the Sesnar Grand feel more like a real piece of Star Trek history. The resort's promotional material apparently uses an animated series-style aesthetic, which is a nice touch considering how much Strange New Worlds likes to connect itself to older versions of the franchise. The wreckage also contains familiar objects, including a Tribble and Alexander Rozhenko's remote-controlled vehicle from Rascals. Those details don't fundamentally change the story, but they do something useful. They make the Sesnar Grand feel like a place that exists inside the wider Star Trek universe, rather than a set invented solely for this episode. And that's something Strange New Worlds is usually very good at. It can introduce something ridiculous while still making it feel like it belongs to a much larger continuity. There is one other complication here, though: James T. Kirk. Because Kirk happens to be vacationing on the same planet. And this is where the Sesnar setting becomes a little too convenient. It's already a coincidence that the Enterprise crew ends up at this particular resort. Then Kirk is there too. Then he becomes involved in the strange events surrounding the crew. And because this is Strange New Worlds, the show once again gets another opportunity to build the relationship between Kirk and Spock. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Paul Wesley has been good in the role, and the developing friendship between Kirk and Spock is obviously something the series wants to explore before the original series timeline arrives. But there is a point where coincidence starts becoming noticeable. If Kirk keeps appearing wherever Pike's crew happens to go, then the universe starts feeling smaller. And the Sesnar Grand is another example of that. It isn't enough to have an alien vacation world, it also has to be the place where Kirk happens to be. That makes the Sesnar setting useful for the franchise's character relationships, but it also makes the galaxy feel strangely convenient. So what exactly is the Sesnar? Based on what we know from this episode, it isn't some secret alien species waiting to be revealed. The important thing about Sesnar is the environment. It's a world where naturally occurring gases can create an intoxicating effect, and the Sesnar Grand has turned that phenomenon into a vacation experience. And that simple idea drives almost everything that happens in Human Best Friend. The crew goes there because Pike wants his officers to relax. The atmosphere affects them. They lose their memories. Ortega and Scotty have to investigate. The crew's personal tensions come to the surface. And eventually, they have to return to the Enterprise before a diplomatic event that could have serious consequences. So while the episode may not reveal some enormous hidden Sesnar mythology, the planet still serves an important purpose. It temporarily strips away the identities that these characters normally hide behind. And perhaps that's why the best moments of the episode aren't actually the biggest jokes. They're the moments when the characters accidentally tell the truth. Ortega and Scotty finally acknowledge why they irritate each other. Una gets to unleash herself on Klingon karaoke. And the normally disciplined officers are forced to confront what happens when they aren't completely in control. That's the interesting part of Sesnar. Not that it makes people drunk, but for a few hours it makes them different people. And whether you think Human Best Friend successfully uses that idea or wastes it under too much comedy probably comes down to what you wanted from the episode. If you wanted a ridiculous Star Trek vacation story, Sesnar gives the writers exactly what they need. If you wanted the Enterprise crew to remain grounded characters dealing with a believable problem, the same premise becomes much harder to pull off. Either way, the Sesnar Grand has now joined the long list of strange places in the Star Trek universe, where you probably shouldn't assume that a relaxing vacation is actually going to be relaxing. Because apparently, in the 23rd century, even taking a day off can turn into a diplomatic crisis. And knowing the Enterprise crew, that's probably the most believable part of the whole episode.